on Fancred. We are loaded like a baked potato today at Sizzler. We've got David Jones coming up from the Harrisburg Patriot News and CSN Philly. He knows Penn State better probably than anybody in the country. We'll talk Penn State football, Big Ten, and get in perhaps to some SB2. A great guest lineup that also includes Jason Gay of the Wall Street Journal. We'll talk about his column on Dan Snyder and the quagmire in D.C. with the Redskins. We've got Arash Markazi coming on from the Los Angeles Times. And it turns out that Kawhi Leonard and Paul George in recent days have been booed in public in Los Angeles. That was reported by Arash in the LA Times this morning. We'll talk to him about that public treatment of those guys and what the Clippers look like for this season and the Lakers. It's a golden age of basketball that we're about to embark on here in Los Angeles. And Chris Villani will join us from Boston. He's in court every day for the college admission scandal trials. So he's right there. And he will be one of the first people to know how many years is Lori Loughlin, Aunt Becky, going to get in federal prison. She's looking at 40 years. So we'll talk to him about that, but we'll also talk to him about USC and the athletic department of the football program. Is it continuing to be intertwined in that college admissions scandal? That's coming up later in the show. But first, we got to get out to David Jones. We've got to get the scoop on Penn State. There's no better person to talk to. Long time Penn State beat writer, reporter, columnist, television personality, you name it. CSN Philadelphia, CSN Philly.
They don't have me on anymore, Brooks. That's kind of old news. They don't have anybody on anymore. It's all about Eagles, and Eagles programming, and that's.
But Penn State's not that big, of course.
Penn State's huge in Philadelphia.
Exactly, that's what I'm saying.
They have their own metrics, and I don't pretend to understand them. But yeah, that's what they do now.
So Penn State football, I want to touch on that. Also want to touch on SB 206. And let's lead off with that briefly. What do you think about that? What's your first blush reaction?
I talked to Jay Billis about it last night. I love it. I mean, we talked about it. I actually posted a story this morning, just a Q&A, because you talk to Jay about this stuff and you kind of have to stop and say, wait a minute now. It's like talking to a nuclear physicist. But
he's freaking awesome. Or you have to translate what he's saying in a sense, right?
Yeah, you have to slow him down if you're dumb guys like us. But by the way, it's great to have you back, Brooks.
Thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it. It's great to be talking to you, man. Yeah. Seriously.
And we by chance about 2 years ago I had asked him specifically about the Olympic model. And then, about 5 months after that in the winter, Mark Emmert actually brought it up and said, well, this might be something we need to talk about. I think it was January of 18, right in there. Then at the Final Four, he walked it all back like he'd never said it. And I said, why did that happen? And Jay said, well, because the money man who pays his salary, the presidents told him, quit talking like that. So I'm sure the Power Five doesn't want any part of it. They'll fight it as long as they can until they realize they're going to have. I mean, you just see Florida this morning. Florida's initiative going. I just don't think you can put this Jack in the Box back in the box at this point.
It is fascinating to see the NCAA fighting something that doesn't actually cost the schools anything now, because they know it will lead. I think it's going to lead to a full-blown compensation model. This is the first step.
Yeah, and I think what Jay thinks is it's going to go federal very quickly, and this will end up in Congress. And in his words, he said, okay, don't worry about the confusion, NCAA. Don't worry about leveling your playing field. We're going to level it for you. So just go back about running your billion-dollar business, and we'll take care of it. This will be a federal problem.
But looking at interaction, I've done a little studying on this with Congress, the NCAA, and pay for play. One thing to think about, and one of the reasons why it was able to get through the California Assembly, is the NCAA over the years, when they've faced that prospect to pay for play in Congress, when there's been hearings, the NCAA has succeeded in lobbying and paying off politicians and blocking it in such a way.
No.
Whereas,
really?
exactly. But the problem that the NCAA has in California is The California Assembly's already spoken for. It's already been bought off. Sorry.
What about a new car?
Right, exactly. Let's go to Bordeaux, France. Hell, wine tour. How's it sound? But no, I mean, the unions have it under lock and key. So that's, what's happening in California. I do think if you do get that momentum, and what we're going to see is police escorts for the legislators in Alabama. They'll probably have their own escorts to the state house. They're going to mobilize instantly at some point. And I think if you get that sort of a groundswell, then I think Congress would be likely to go along.
Well,
who knows, though?
If California and Florida are a part of these things individually,
right,
they're gonna cut those states free and go about their business. No, it's impossible. It can't happen. It can't work. And what it amounts to is a really big recruiting advantage for the schools in those states, should they acquiesce and just say, this is the wave of the future. We've got until 2023. Why don't we just put together an all-encompassing model for the whole country? Come on.
We're visiting with David Jones of the Harrisburg Patriot News, covers Penn State. Penn State's one of those teams. They're, in the same boat as far as I'm concerned, at least in terms of evaluating them as Ohio State, in that we really don't know where Penn State is. We thought they might get a test against Maryland. That didn't happen. But I wanted to ask you first of all about the Maryland game. I mean, what's the story in that game? Why was it such? I mean, I know James Franklin was running it up because of his treatment at Maryland. Is that safe to say?
I don't think he had to run it up. I think Maryland's, I don't know if you knew this, but the Maryland quarterback is my nephew.
Wow.
You didn't know that probably.
Holy smokes, no.
Josh Jackson is my nephew. He transferred in as a grad transfer from Virginia Tech. So it was a very, very weird, strange situation for me. I had been taking a close look at that team since the Syracuse game. They beat Syracuse 63-20 when Syracuse was ranked? Remember that? Actually,
Dino Babers is a genius. How many times are we going to hear that? And Jeremy Pruitt's a genius. We heard that too going into the season.
Anyway, yeah, they really beat up Syracuse, and Josh had a great game. But they lost an offensive lineman there. They lost Marcus Minor. Then they lost a starting guard. And by the end of the Penn State game, they had lost 3 starting offensive linemen, but they'd already lost 2 going into that game. And Josh is not terribly mobile. And they just started blitzing and stunning on him, and they couldn't do anything about it. The 2 passes that he threw that were interceptions, I think were less about pressure than just Penn State's speed. I mean, they've got speed all over the field, and they rush you. It was almost a carbon copy of the Nebraska-Ohio State game if you watch that. Martinez is a really, really good young quarterback, but he was rushing everything he did. He threw 2-3 early interceptions. He's a better quarterback than that. But when defenses speed you up that way, it makes you do things that you wouldn't normally do. And I think in both cases, Maryland and Nebraska were overwhelmed. And Penn State has Ohio State's kind of speed, especially on defense. They do.
So as I'm looking at the rankings right now, Penn State's number 12, Wisconsin's number 8. Are we sleeping on Penn State right now?
I think I was a little bit because Sean Clifford, their quarterback, while he didn't have a terribly challenging game against Maryland's defense, they chose to play a lot of man. And you cannot let that. I don't know if you've seen too much of KJ Hamler, their little sophomore wideout, but he is really fast. What he reminds me of is remember the kid at LSU about a decade ago named Trindon Holiday. You remember him?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
An incredibly dangerous punt returner, right. And it gets big yak in situations where he's one-on-one on guys. He just shredded him. I mean, they got him out in the open. A lot of checkdowns from Sean Clifford, and he's dangerous, man. I mean, he ran all over the field. I think if Clifford plays that way against pressure, which he didn't really get against Maryland, then we'll see something. Right now, I think he's in the second tier of quarterbacks in the league simply because he hasn't had as much experience. But, Ohio State's quarterback hasn't any experience either, but Justin Fields is taking Ohio State back to a place where they were when they had JT Barrett. They're running a lot of that stuff. And yet he is so fast. He's much faster than JT was. He flings the ball around like Haskins. And what I think sets Ohio State apart is their offensive line is playing at an elite college football playoff level. They
Well,
are really, really good if you watch them.
I think a date to save is November 23rd, Penn State at Ohio State. That could be one of the biggest games of the season. And that could be a game if Penn State's able to run the table. And why can't they at this point? You look at their schedule and how they played so far. Am I overreacting, though? Is Penn State, you think, going to run the table going into that game?
Let's wait. I mean, we've got Iowa. We have to go to Iowa. We're taking our first when we take road trips around the Big Ten, we always joke about some of the garden spots around the league. Iowa's going to be a night game. I've seen them all so many times. I actually ranked them last year. We had some
East Lansing.
Kinnick is one of my favorite places to go. They just named it as a night game. That's going to be a hornet's nest. Every time Iowa has had a night game, it's been a really, really tough place for Penn State to play. So I think Penn State fans are probably tempering their enthusiasm until they wait and see. Nate Stanley, we were talking about first-tier quarterbacks. Nate Stanley is playing like an elite quarterback right now for Iowa. He's got a gun. He has had kind of a gunslinger mentality before. He played horribly at Penn State last year. But you remember had the huge day against Ohio State 2 years ago, and then when they beat him by 31. He's capable of anything at any time, but he's been around. So that's the thing in that game, in the Iowa-Penn State game. Clifford really hasn't been through one of these games. Nate Stanley has, many of them.
So before I let you go, I want to ask you about James Franklin. You wrote an article last year about the possibility of James Franklin going to USC. Of course, Urban Meyer wasn't in play at the time you wrote that article, but where are you on James Franklin now and his future at Penn State?
I think the landscape has changed because Urban Meyer is involved in it now. I think that's still in play. We don't know who the AD is out there, right? I mean, do we even have any idea who the AD is going to be out there?
Not yet, but I do think that that's going to be incidental. Just from my sources here, that's what I'm hearing. I think that you're going to have Rick Caruso, chairman of the board of trustees, the president, Carol Folt. There, for all intents and purposes, they're going to run the show. They're already out canvassing and interviewing candidates. Well, not the candidates themselves, but people who surround those candidates. So I don't think the AD is that big of a deal. I also, David, personally, I don't think Urban Meyer is going to take the job.
He's not an LA guy, really, to me.
Right. Right.
To me, he fits more at Florida State, that kind of place. Wouldn't that piss off the Gator Nation, huh?
Well, that would be fat. I hadn't even. It's amazing that you bring that up, and the dynamic of the ACC and the low hanging fruit besides Clemson, and when you look at Clemson, some sources have told me close to the situation at Clemson that if and when Nick Saban retires over the next, if it's like 3 or 4 years from now, Dabo Swinney will walk to Alabama because, of course, he played as a walk-on there, a national championship team. But there's a lot of talk. He's not going to leave. I've been told he's going to leave.
Fans always say that. They always think, look at this business right now. This has never been more of a business. I'll just use for an example Josh Gaddis, who's now the offensive coordinator at Michigan. He was here at Penn State making, we would guess, about $300,000 a year 2 years ago. Then he went to work for Saban. He made $525,000. Now he's at Michigan working for Harbaugh, making $900,000 with incentives up to $1.2 as a coordinator in 2 years. That's what not only assistants can do going to coordinators, but coordinators can do going to head coaches, and head coaches can do job hopping to other head coaching jobs. The money is obscene, which brings us around to the California legislature and why let's let the kids have a little chunk of these profits. Can't we?
We're all, and you know what, Dave? We're all witnesses. It's on us, I think. I mean, hey, thanks so much, man. We got to do this again. I want to talk to you again. Absolutely. Bro. Check in and have a great basketball game today.
Basketball?
Right.
Yeah.
Did you say you were going to play basketball, right? Is
that what I play? Yeah. I don't.
Yeah, right. It resembles it, I think.
I'm the old guy to say, great shot, Dave, whenever I hit anything anymore. But, thanks, Bill.
That's David Jones. He is with the Harrisburg Patriot News. Great guy. Wish we had more time with him. He's got to go play basketball right now. And, of course, that trumps everything. So, but we talked to him, of course, about Penn State, James Franklin. And I personally think that James Franklin is a leading candidate for that job, although I've gotten no indication so far that there's been any reach out from the guy who's leading the search, Rick Caruso, the chairman of the board of trustees. You've got a couple of other people on the board of trustees that are involved in the search, purportedly. And one of them is a name you may know, Jeff Smulian, longtime former Seattle Mariners owner and now a part owner of the Boston Red Sox, but a guy who's been involved in sports forever and a radio business mogul, Jeff Smulian. He's on the board of trustees at USC. And Bill McMorrow is another name. Those three guys, primarily, along with Carol Folt, the president, they're not just drawing up a list. And they don't have a grease board out, in some mansion somewhere in Bel Air where they're spitballing candidates. That's not what's happening. They're actively out, contacting people that are connected to possible candidates, and they're talking to those people. I can tell you that based on sources that I've talked to. So when it comes to the athletic director, that's also a similar process that's going on right now. And I do think you're going to have an outsider come in for the first time. And, at least since I've been here almost 20 years, and I've worked with USC on their football and basketball broadcasts. I did that for several years. So I've been around the USC athletic department, have friends there, and the football program as well. And so for them to bring in an outsider as athletic director, that is a major statement. The problem is he's not going to hire the coach because, again, there's already a process that's moving, which I think is I don't necessarily think having a contingency plan, if you're USC, is a bad thing to have individuals on the board of trustees aware of what's happening. But I think the fact that Rick Caruso is directly involved right now in assessing candidates, talking to people around those candidates who are connected to those candidates, is an indication that perhaps Rick Caruso, the chairman of the board of trustees at USC, is part of the problem, and problems of the past perhaps could be traced to him, and he's still there. All right. Carol Folt came in. Caruso, of course, was the prime mover in her getting hired, the USC president. All right. So you would say to yourself, well, she answers to Rick Caruso. Not necessarily. Things are changing at USC, and Carol Folt has fired dozens and dozens of USC faculty and personnel, including Lynn Swan, the athletic director. So there's a new sheriff in town. And just because Rick Caruso was the guy that tabbed Carol Folt for the job doesn't mean that she's beholden to him. In fact, I know she's not, because Rick Caruso has told people who I know and have told me that because Rick Caruso is an Urban Meyer guy, but he has told people who have told me that he may be outnumbered when it comes to the coaching hire. What does that mean? That's the word that one source in particular used when describing the situation to me. It tells me that, there's obviously more than he's not the only guy making that call. And in the past, that's been the case, along with Wayne Hughes, the Public Storage CEO and founder. Now, Wayne Hughes out of the picture, and Bill McMorrow and Jeff Smulian are the guys right now with Rick Caruso. Those are all new names that we're bringing to light here on Sports by Brooks on Fancred. We do this show every day, Monday through Friday, noon to about 2 o'clock Eastern time. Yesterday, we went all the way up to 2 o'clock. And today we have a very full show. College football on tap, out of the gate. You heard it with David Jones. We're going to have him back because that November 23rd game, Penn State at Ohio State, is going to be perhaps one of the biggest games of the season. Of course, Penn State has to go to Iowa, has to go to Michigan State. Those are both road games. They've got a home game against Michigan. And obviously, it goes without saying, you don't sleep on Michigan. We saw what happened last year, right? Michigan, of course, shattered Ohio State's season in the rivalry game, arguably the biggest rivalry game in the country every year, Ohio State and Michigan. So who the hell knows with Jim Harbaugh? You just never know. But Penn State is a team to watch. And so when you're looking at that game against Maryland, 59-0, that's pretty harsh. Yeah, it's pretty harsh. But you could make the argument, and I'm not a James Franklin fan. Let's be honest. There's not a lot of James Franklin fans outside of the fans of the team that he's coaching when they're winning, right? I mean, he's a persuasive guy. He's a great recruiter. He is an accomplished self-promoter. And nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But James Franklin, when he was at Maryland, remember that game was against Maryland. James Franklin had 2 stints at Maryland as an assistant coach. And if you go back in his resume, the longest period of time that he has spent at a single school, because he's one of those guys that seems like every year, which is fine. He's moving up the ladder. That's great. But he actually spent, I think, 6 years in his second stint with Maryland after an earlier space of time in which he was on the Terrapin staff. And in that second stint, he was on Ralph Friedgen's staff. And this is when we had, you may remember the phenomena of the coach in waiting. Remember Will Muschamp at Texas, where that sort of principle was formalized. Same thing to a certain extent with Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma, but it wasn't necessarily articulated as overtly in public at Oklahoma as it was in Texas. It was announced. And talk about something right out of the bad idea department, right? File that under the bad idea department. So, yeah, that was a disaster at Texas, the coach in waiting principle. Well, that was about the same time that James Franklin was the de facto coach in waiting for Ralph Friedgen. But when the head coaching situation in Ralph Friedgen opened up, James Franklin was passed over. He was led to believe that he was going to be the head coach at Maryland, and he was passed over, right? Now, fast forward to last Friday. He's got Penn State. He's taking on Maryland. And you're saying to yourself, why is it 41-0 at halftime? Why are they passing when they're up 51-0? Now you know why. That's why. What's astonishing, and I think it really speaks to, and I'm a broken record on this on the show, is, it's such the college football sports media spews out cotton candy 99.9% of the time, right? And I've gone through it, and we all know why, because their bread is buttered. Their business model is based on their relationships with the conferences. And they want to keep those television contracts. So they don't want to say anything. And I'm not saying this is a conspiracy. Maybe I am, but it's in the back of the minds of the broadcasters and the talk show hosts, because I've been one of them. But so Penn State goes and beats Maryland 59-0, runs it up like nobody's business. And nobody's talking about what happened to James Franklin at Maryland, except a guy that's been on our show, Tim Brando. To his credit, and he was doing the game, to his credit, he mentioned it prominently. But he's the only guy I have seen in the media who said, well, shouldn't have passed over him in Maryland. This is what you get. That's all you got to say. I mean, maybe there were some people out there, but I follow it pretty damn closely. So it's obvious. And it's almost like people don't want to mention it. I don't know. Don't want to step on James Franklin's toes, or why would that matter? Or, the administration at Maryland athletic department, or maybe Brooks is just full of, what, maybe I'm just an idiot and I'm reading into things that aren't there. That could be it as well. So we're going to continue to talk college football on this show. We do it every day. I want you to know that. Sports by Brooks on Fancred. We're on at noon Eastern time. And you can comment as you watch the show, and at times you can join me on screen on the fan line. But first, we're going to go out to Boston, and we're going to visit with a guy who is boots on the ground inside the federal courthouse following the college admissions scandal trials. As close to it as anybody out there on a day-to-day basis, Chris Villani joins us. Hey, Chris, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I am fantastic now that I have somebody that we can talk to that is right there because, and of course, you are covering that college admissions scandal every single day, and I'm seeing these sentences being passed down, and I'm in a state of shock. That Felicity Huffman gets jail time. I can't believe it. And it appears that had she not, done that defense the way she did it, it might have been worse. And now I'm looking at Aunt Becky, right? I'm looking at Lori Loughlin, and I don't know, everybody's kind of thinking the same thing. 40 years? I mean, where does she stand right now in your educated opinion?
Well, the sentences have definitely produced dramatic, polarizing reactions for two different reasons. There's the group that thinks that, wow, these people are really getting a slap on the wrist compared to some of the news reports you see from around the country of people, particularly people of a much lower socioeconomic status, people of color and whatnot, that get sometimes years behind bars for nonviolent offenses. And then there's the group that says, wow, I can't believe these people are going to jail at all. And people who cover white collar crime, as I do, will tell you that for first time offenders, when the sentencing guidelines call for a maximum of 6 months, it's pretty rare to see people go to prison at all. That's usually a good opportunity for probation, second chance, some period of supervised release, maybe a fine, some sort of restitution, and you move on. So I think we were all kind of surprised from people who were close to the case that Felicity Huffman got any jail time at all.
Right.
A 2-week sentence is kind of a weird sentence. It's almost like when the NCAA sat Johnny Manziel for a half back in the day. Like usually it's done in periods of months, not weeks. So it was kind of an odd sentence. But as far as Lori Loughlin goes and her husband, Massimo Giannulli, 40 years is the maximum for the two conspiracy charges. Nobody does 40 years. Nobody does the maximum. I've seen people who have stolen millions and millions of dollars over a period of years where there's tangible victims, ruined lives. They don't get the maximum. And maybe that's another separate conversation about sentencing and how it's done at the federal level. What she may be looking at, and again, she's still fighting the case, so she may be able to win this and end up with nothing at all, not a conviction or anything, but she's definitely looking at prison time. That's clear. Every parent...
Hold on, let me stop you.
Yep.
Aunt Becky is definitely looking at prison time.
Unless she beats the case. That's a big...
Well, yeah.
Big, oh, by the way.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, there's no question about it, because 3 parents have been sentenced. There's Felicity Huffman, but then there's 2 others that are a much lower Q rating, I guess. They're wealthy executives who each got 4 months in prison. There's 2 more sentencings that are set for Thursday and Friday, where the government is looking for prison. And so far, they're batting 1,000. They're 3 for 3. And these are people who pled guilty, accepted responsibility. In Felicity Huffman's case, was accused or pled guilty to paying much less, only $15,000 to alter SAT scores, as opposed to the $500,000 that Lori Loughlin and Massimo Giannulli are accused of spending here for recruiting fraud. So everybody's getting prison time. And a big part of the federal sentencing guidelines is avoiding disparate sentences. And if she's convicted, there's no chance.
Interesting.
It'll be a question of how long, not whether she goes to prison.
You just said avoiding disparate sentences. Is that in the context of all of the defendants of this particular case? I mean, they don't want to have one person get nothing and then the next person get 2 years. That's what you mean. So then that's the indication that Lori Loughlin's looking at jail time.
Well, exactly, because if you look at some of the parents, and Felicity Huffman's not a great comp because, again, the money is so much less. But if you look at some of the other parents that engaged in the scheme for a longer period of time, involved their children, spent in the six figures, sometimes well into the six figures to get their kids into college. Two of them have already been sentenced to 4 months in prison. And these are people who pled guilty and had a relatively early acceptance of responsibility. Lori Loughlin. I mean, if she were to plead guilty tomorrow, she's still looking at prison time. I just don't see any way around it. She's got some of the best lawyers in the country, don't get me wrong, but I don't think there's a chance based on the fact that you have other people that are already being sentenced to prison. It's a different judge. She's before a different judge, Judge Nathaniel Gorton, but he's considered to be much harder on defendants, frankly, than Judge Indira Talwani, who's the one who's already sentenced Felicity Huffman and the other two parents who pled guilty.
Besides her meditation and yoga, what's your assessment of her defense? Or are we able to assess what they're going to do in the courtroom with her defense?
Yeah, we are. Just based on some statements that her attorneys have made, it looks like it's going to be kind of a state of mind defense. So just a quick primer for people who might not be familiar with all the players here. There's a guy, William Rick Singer. He pled guilty to being the mastermind of this scheme and taking in millions upon millions in bribes from who knows how many parents over the course of years. So the defense, it seems, will be that donations that were made either to the university, in this case it was USC, or to Singer and his Key Worldwide Foundation were, they thought, above board donations to universities that take donations all the time, and to charities who exist solely for the purpose of taking donations and doling them out, right? That's why the only thing that charities do. So that, I think, will be what they will argue. They'll point the finger at Singer, who's going to be the star witness in as many trials as they end up having in this case, and say that was the scoundrel. We didn't know what was going on. We thought that everything was kind of above board here. So, and that's why they also want to be tried together, Lori Loughlin and her husband, and have the same attorneys, because they're intending to put on a unified front and say that they thought the money that they were giving was legitimate, not illegal, and just contributions that didn't represent the kind of quid pro quo that the government's alleging here.
And that's part of the whole strategy of setting up the charity with Rick Singer.
Yeah, right, exactly.
That's the cover.
The Worldwide Foundation, was sort of the front for, again, the number of parents he worked with from his admissions to the government was in the hundreds. Only 52 people, and that includes coaches and Singer himself, have been charged in this case. So it seems like a tip of the iceberg thing, and to try to figure out how much money he actually funneled through this charity over the years.
So we're visiting with Chris Villani in Boston. He is the Boston's courts reporter for Law 360, law360.com. You can go to Law 360 on Twitter. Also makes appearances on ESPN Radio. Happy to have him today. And I wanted you to kind of back up a little bit, because nobody probably has a better grasp of the day-to-day with this case. But as you think about it in its length and width and breadth, it's striking to me that you have some massive celebrities involved here, and we have an entanglement of athletic departments, not just USC, the University of Texas, and there's others. But it's striking to me that we have entertainment celebrities, but so far, somehow, we haven't had sports celebrities, even though a Phil Mickelson, a Joe Montana, and there's been mentions of the USC football program by the feds, by the DOJ, nameless individuals. Do you think that this is something? Well, I mean, we don't know, but what's your assessment of that situation? And is it possible that at some point a shoe will drop and some big time sports guys will come out?
Well, it's possible. If you were to ask the feds, they would say the same thing they always say, right? The investigation is ongoing.
Right.
But it is. We're seeing new charges. It's not just something that they're saying. So initially 50 people were charged. That was back in March. Since then, 2 more people have been charged, including one individual just 2 weeks ago, a Canadian woman who was vacationing in Spain. So there was a lot of international intrigue, I suppose, with that one. She was arrested in Spain and is being extradited here now. So there is an ongoing component to the investigation.
Yeah, that's crucial to that.
Yeah, Singer's still cooperating. And it also, when it comes to the parents and the coaches and administrators, there's 2 groups. There's those who have pled guilty and those who have not. as more people, and I think probably more people will slide from the group that is fighting the charges to the group that pleads guilty and is cooperating, you might see more names that maybe one individual has, but another individual doesn't. And USC is clearly the school to keep an eye on here. There's a big nexus of this entire thing at USC. It's touched Georgetown, Wake Forest, UCLA, Stanford. There have been other schools as well, but USC is kind of where the big nexus of this case is. So if it were to happen, and I'm just speculating here, but if it were to happen, I would say USC is probably the place to look, because there's still some coaches and administrators tied to that school who are fighting the charges. If they flip, they're going to cooperate with the government, and they're going to name names, and we'll see what they say, and then what the government decides to do in terms of prosecuting more people.
Now, I don't know if you've seen, but I've done 6 posts on the college admission scandal on Sports by Brooks. And of course, Joe Montana has acknowledged that he knew Rick Singer and patronized his services, but of course, everything was above board. But on my website, I have a post, and I was able to find a promotional video that included Joe Montana, his son Nick Montana, and Rick Singer. And Singer is the star of this promotional video. It's done for one of these private quarterbacks coaches who has enlisted the services of Joe Montana, and he's got Rick Singer there. So it's a full service thing, right? The tutor who's going to tutor your child to become an NFL quarterback. So this video was filmed on Maui. And at one point, Chris, there's a classroom shot, and Rick Singer is in front of the blackboard. I mean, and Nick Montana is sitting right there, Joe Montana's son. So it's on my website. Joe Montana has acknowledged it. And then you've got Phil Mickelson. That's another post on my website. Phil Mickelson, of course, there's a testimonial on Rick Singer's old website that I was able to get from archive.org. And in that testimonial, Mickelson talks about how shocked his daughter was. We really appreciate it. She couldn't believe she got into Brown. So it's really remarkable. And so one question I was going to ask you is, let's say somebody like a Joe Montana, or anybody necessarily, a high profile person, is cooperating. Would that ever come out? Is there a chance that a guy like Mickelson could be cooperating and ratting other people out? We just don't know that.
Yeah, it's possible. The only way that you would know it is a witness list, pretrial witness list that were to come out. And, even in that instance, doesn't mean that person's going to be called to testify. Witness lists usually have a lot more people than actually end up getting called to the stand. So that's totally possible. And it kind of brings up what's sort of the other interesting part of this, is that Singer did, by all indications, provide legitimate services, legitimate tutoring services, legitimate counseling services on essays, and it has highlighted, and the judge in the case, and Indira Talwani, has pointed this out quite a bit, just the gaping gap between rich and poor when it comes to the college admissions process. You can afford, even if it's not through a bribe, to spend $10, $20, $30, $50,000 on somebody like Rick Singer to give your kid the best chance possible to get into Brown or UCLA or Georgetown or Wake Forest or Stanford. So, and that'll also, I think, be central to the defense, going back to Aunt Becky, is this guy provided legitimate services. We thought that's what he was doing. I think you're going to hear a lot of that from the defendants who, if they do continue to fight this, go to trial. As you assess this case and you're looking ahead, what are the most interesting things that you're looking for that are going to be coming out in the future? Sure. Well, in the immediate future, there's sentencings. So this case, it sometimes gets a little wonky, but this case is actually like 6 different cases, because if you plead guilty, you're charged a certain way. If you don't plead guilty, you're charged a certain way. So those who have pled guilty, the parents, there's 11 of them. 3 have been sentenced. 2 more are going to be sentenced this week on Thursday and Friday. So the first thing will be, what sentences do they get? It seems like 4 months now, if you spent in the hundreds of thousands and had your kid involved in the scheme and things like that, were a little bit more involved than Felicity Huffman. 4 months seems to be the going rate. We'll see. I think it'll be in the number of months. I don't think anybody's going to get years in prison, but that'll be something to keep an eye on. And then over the winter, It'll be curious to see who flips. I would imagine there's going to be more guilty pleas in the case involving coaches and administrators, which again is separate from Aunt Becky. She's a parent in this case. There was a report just 2 days ago, a status report filed by the government that said they're in plea negotiations with additional defendants. So that indicates multiple guilty pleas could be on the way. So that'll be the next thing. And then the third thing will be whoever's left, are they going to trial? And then how many trials? There's 19 parents charged in one superseding indictment. Are they going to be all tried together? That seems unwieldy to say the least. How is that going to play out? And that'll be a little bit more down the line. We're looking into next year. So sentencings for those who pled guilty, who pleads guilty next, and then ultimately the trial or trials that follow. Those are the next three big steps in this case. And then the side part of it, we can't really prepare for it, but it may happen. It's happened already, is what you alluded to before. Are there any new names, big names, or, quote unquote, nobody's, just other rich people that can afford to pay Rick Singer that come to light? So that's pretty much in a nutshell what to look for in this case going forward. One
of the big names who's not a celebrity, but a big name in the context of this case is Donna Heinel. Arguably the biggest name besides a celebrity, who worked in the athletic department at USC and was the third most powerful person there. And there's been an effort in Los Angeles, it seems like this is me talking, to, Pat, there was an article about Pat Hayden recently in the Los Angeles Times that essentially said Pat Hayden had nothing to do with anything, even though Pat Hayden was the guy that hired Donna Heinel and had an extremely close relationship with her. Now, there's some emails that were in this report in the Los Angeles Times that indicate maybe it was an arm's length relationship between Pat Hayden and Rick Singer, but they did meet on a couple of occasions, Rick Singer and Pat Hayden. So that aside, what about Donna Heinel? Because if someone like her, if she flips, now you're talking. I think there's a lot of new stuff's going to come out.
Well, yeah, and she's probably the biggest, like you said, in the context of the case, not necessarily in the world, but the biggest name that's still kind of fighting the charges because of that big nexus, like I was mentioning to USC, and all the information that she's apt to have, not only on people involved in the case, but people who have not been either charged or who are maybe being investigated. And that's a pretty wide number of people. And
that's the football program. A football program could be involved in this, at USC.
It's a wide net. It's a very wide net potentially. And I know there was a report, I think it was in the LA Times several months ago, about wealthy parents and wealthy folks in California and that sort of social circle getting a little nervous because they've worked with Rick Singer, they've worked with Donna Heinel in the past. So, and another part of it too, from USC's perspective, there's an ongoing fight over documents that one of the defendants, one of the parents who's fighting the charges, wants to obtain that show sort of a preference system that's given and I don't think this would shock people that certain people who are connected to the administration or for whatever reason get a little bit of a leg up in the college admissions process, but it's potentially embarrassing for USC, who's arguing it's irrelevant and trying to keep it from public view. That's one of the 50 different fronts where this is playing out. And last year here in Boston, there was a different case involving affirmative action at Harvard University that people think is going to head to the Supreme Court. It's embarrassing for a university to have its admissions process sort of laid bare. And I think that might be what USC is trying to avoid. And that's just, again, another in the 50 interesting different layers of this case when you really start to get into the weeds of it on a day-to-day basis.
Talking to Chris Villani of law360.com and Rick Singer now. What's the situation with him? You said he's continuing to cooperate with the feds. And of course, he's the oracle here. And I think just from my own study and research of him over the course of about a month, this is the tip of the iceberg. This guy was intertwined with AAU basketball like nobody's business. And I document some of that on my website. He was involved with this private quarterbacks coach who worked to place his clients, the kids, but of course he's soliciting the parents at high profile, getting scholarships for them. Rick Singer worked with this person, Steve Clarkson, who is a very well-known quarterbacks coach. You pay him a lot of money and he gets your kid into college on a scholarship. Theoretically, that's what he does, though. But he also worked with a guy who does that for place kickers. Rick Singer did. Similar situation, and there's the starting place kicker, and his name escapes me at the moment, but the article's on my website. The starting place kicker for Arizona, and he had previously started for Cal. He transferred to Arizona, has a testimonial to Rick Singer on Singer's website, right? This is a starter for Arizona last season, and this guy attended this Chris Saylor's guy's kicking camp. Chris Saylor is like a Steve Clarkson. He's been around forever. And I know Singer has a relationship with Saylor. So those are just two examples of some of the things. There's more that I've discovered. So I'm really fascinated to see how far is Singer going to go. My thought on it, and I want to get your thought. You're there. So is I think Singer is actually entertaining the prospect of getting out of prison at some point. And for that reason, maybe he's more likely to hedge in that cooperation and not rat everybody out, and completely cancel his life. I mean, what's your thought on it?
Well, he is. I know I said a little while ago that everybody's looking at months in jail. I'm talking about the parents and the coaches, not him. He's looking at years in jail. We're looking at a massive amount of money that was involved in this in this scheme that's all tied back to him. So, and he gained a lot of that money, which is going to count against him when it comes to sentencing. So he's looking at a decade, maybe in jail. It's going to be substantial prison time for him. He has said that he worked with about 700 different families. That number, when you start to look at it and see the full imprint, feels low. And that doesn't mean everybody took a bribe. Again, there were legitimate services that apparently were being provided here, but it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. How many people he's going to, rat out, as you say, and then how many people the government wants to prosecute is also a matter of some question. There is a point to be made about general deterrence, and maybe the government has made that by charging 52 people and doesn't want to continue to expend resources down this particular rabbit hole. So that's a question as well. But Singer's going to continue to cooperate. His sentencing was scheduled actually for last month, been pushed back. It's going to continue to get pushed back because they'll probably want to sentence him towards the end, or at least somewhat close to a lot of the other people in this case. But he is looking at substantial prison time. What kind of a life he's thinking about after, I don't know at this point.
He's mentioned that. I read in one interview that he fully expects to get out of prison. It's just a matter of he's gonna and he's not gonna die in prison. But I mean, what is he, in his 60s, mid 60s?
Yeah, and I guess I don't know what the actuarial tables are when you go to prison. I'm sure it's not as good as living in the general population. Right. Sure, but he's of an age where, and we're not looking at 20 years. I don't think we're looking at a sentence where
really he's not going to get 20 years.
I don't think so.
Really?
I really don't think so.
That's
Again,
amazing.
People who have stolen millions and millions of dollars and ruined lives. And in this case, it's a little bit different than your typical fraud scheme. A lot of times it's just, you invest your money with me, I steal it. It doesn't actually get invested. You lose everything. That sort of a thing. It's a Bernie Madoff type Ponzi scheme. This isn't quite like that. He did have a lot of ill-gotten gains here, but at least in terms of sentencing and from a legal perspective, they're having trouble identifying the true quote unquote victims. Now, you can very easily say college is a zero-sum game. If I got into college through fraud and I wasn't supposed to, I took a seat from somebody else. But not knowing who that person is and sort of the ambiguities in the college admissions process doesn't make that as clear cut as I think people would like it to be. So that'll work in his favor, but it's going to be years. It'll be less than 20. I think his plea agreement, it's been a while since I've read it, but it's somewhere in the teens is what they're going to ask for. That doesn't mean that the judge, usually the defense asks for one thing, prosecution asks for another, judge meets them somewhere in the middle. But it'll be years, but I don't think it'll be 20 years. So my guess is, yeah, he should have some sort of a life after prison.
How big a role does the media, you think, play in the sentences, in the outcome of the trials, in the outcome of the case, in how long the feds are going to prosecute this? What role does the media play in that?
from the sentencing perspective, it's definitely interesting. Judges are human beings, and I remember after Felicity Huffman was sentenced to 2 weeks in prison, Indira Talwani said something to her along the lines of, "Now you don't have to go back to your community and have everybody say you got away with this." And part of me was also thinking, a lot of eyes are on you, Judge, to say you didn't let her get away with this, and sort of give her a slap on the wrist, which I would have bet a lot of money that she was not going to get any jail time, and I would have been wrong. I would have lost. So that's going to play some sort of an impact here. It also depends on the judge. Nathaniel Gorton's the one who's overseeing the case involving Lori Loughlin. He's an octogenarian Navy veteran. I don't know if he particularly cares what the media says about him one way or another, and he's going to do what he thinks is right by the law. As far as the government, they've taken press conferences and sort of spiked the football a little bit when it comes to this particular case. Andrew Lelling, the U.S. attorney, has showed up at Felicity Huffman's sentencing, which, but for the name of the defendant, not the type of case or the type of hearing where he usually would have shown his face, but he was there. So I think the public attention will drive it somewhat, but it's also a department that does have a certain finite number of resources. I still question how many people are going to want to continue to charge and continue to sort of pour resources into this case when drug-related crimes, the opioid crisis, things like that, tend to be a bigger focus for the office.
If there's one name involved on the DOJ Fed side, right, one name who is the driving force behind this case, and if this case continues on and gets legs, would be the person who would be responsible. But I mean, I know there's more than one, obviously, but if you could put one person at the top of that pyramid from the Fed's perspective, what would that name be?
Well, it's Andrew Lelling, the U.S. attorney. He's the one that's driving it. He's an aggressive prosecutor. He's really an interesting character in some senses. He's a nice guy. He comes across as a nice guy that you'd want to hang out and have a beer with. He's sort of that laid back kind of guy, but he's been aggressive in a lot of public corruption cases, whether it's City Hall here in Boston, whether it's a corrupt mayor in Fall River who's accused of taking bribe money from marijuana vendors. And remember, marijuana is illegal at the federal level, and he's prosecuting that, but at the same time defending the pot shops by prosecuting public corruption, trying to extort the pot shops. So he's just, and it'd be a whole other conversation, but he is somebody who doesn't shy away from the limelight and is not afraid to bring unpopular, controversial prosecutions if he thinks it's the right thing to do. So he's definitely the guy to keep an eye on, who's sort of driving the ship.
This was outstanding, Chris. I can't thank you enough, and I look forward to having you back and talking more about this case.
Of course, anytime. It's going to be going on for a while.
So yeah, I'm actually looking forward to it, though, and this is one of the few cases that I'm kind of enjoying the schadenfreude of it, but that's just me. So thanks, Chris. All right, man. That's Chris Valenti. He's with law360.com, law360 on Twitter, makes appearances on ESPN Radio. Holy mackerel. Is that guy good? Did you hear that guy? It was unbelievable. That's why I had him on so long. And he knows his stuff, but you heard me kind of laying out my stuff, and there's a lot more where that came from. I talked about it being the tip of an iceberg. I mean, the stuff that's on my website right now, you can go there at sportsbybrooks.com and just type in Phil Mickelson. And you'll see the testimonial. I've got a screenshot where he's talking about his daughter getting into Brown. Phil Mickelson has acknowledged that he knows Rick Singer, or he knew him before Rick went inside. But everything he did with Rick Singer was above board, was legal, and was not that extensive, right? That's why there's a testimonial of that nature on Rick Singer's website. Now, that being said, I think it's a coin flip whether Rick Singer wrote that himself, that testimonial. There's a bunch of testimonials on Rick Singer's old websites that you can, I believe you could probably still access them on archive.org via the Wayback Machine. I mean, anybody can. You can go comb through his old website, and believe me, I have. I mean, he's got videos on there. This was a pretty big operation. He had a staff. This is the kingpin of the college admissions scandal, Rick Singer. Big deal. And this is Sports by Brooks on Fancred. I'm your host, Brooks Melchior from Los Angeles. More coming up. We got some great guests coming up. Arash Markazi, who's come on already a few times, talking about NBA, Kawhi, Paul George, booed in public earlier this week in Los Angeles. Okay, it's not that big of a deal. I know. What the hell? We got to get into NBA because I love NBA. So we're going to be talking a lot of NBA. We're going to talk to John Ireland, the voice of the Lakers, I think tomorrow, among others, as the week rolls on. And in addition, we'll talk to Jason Gay of the Wall Street Journal. I have been meaning to curb stomp Dan Snyder. And finally, today's the day, at least not Jason necessarily. He wrote an interesting piece about Dan Snyder and the dumpster fire. I mean, if you're going to write about Dan Snyder, it's impossible not to write something. It's involuntary. It's going to come out as a dumpster fire regardless, because that's what it is. So I've been meaning to get to it. And so we're going to do that with one of the best in the business. And he's awesome on Twitter, Jason Gay. I'm serious. If you're watching this, follow him on Twitter, Jason Gay. Outstanding. So we'll talk to him in a minute, and Arash, as we go along. But as far as the college admissions scandal, I want you to know you're probably watching, where you are watching a person that is outside of the people who are prosecuting and defending the case and who are involved in a case, charged and whatnot. I'm as knowledgeable as anybody is. I spent upwards of about a month studying this, and I'm continuing. I was up last night studying it, up last night doing searches, doing all kinds of different creative searches and in order to try to find some things on that case. And I've been able to uncover, especially looking at charities, a lot of activity involving Rick Singer and people in AAU basketball. Rick Barnes, who's now at the University of Tennessee. Rick Singer was involved with Rick Barnes, which I document. That's not an opinion. I document that on SportsbyBrooks.com. Of course, Rick Barnes all of a sudden has come back into prominence thanks to his job at Tennessee that he's done. But when he was involved with Rick Singer, at least the period when I know he was involved, Rick Singer helped to place a Silicon Valley executive's son as a manager on the University of Texas basketball team. The reason I was able to find this was this young man had a testimonial on a Rick Singer site. So I looked up his name, traced his background, and of course, the testimonial was from the University of Texas where Singer had got him into school. Well, Rick Barnes was part of that. And it happened in part through an AAU coach in Houston. Rick Barnes went through an AAU coach in Houston to fix this kid's standardized test scores to assist him in getting in to Texas. And then this AAU coach in Houston used his contacts with Rick Barnes, who was then the head coach of the University of Texas in basketball, used those contacts to place this extremely rich billionaire Silicon Valley executive's son as a manager for the University of Texas, right? That's what happened. And when I was talking, you just heard me talking to Chris Valenti a minute ago. That's just one example of what I've found in the context of AAU basketball. This involved, and I want to point out, by the way, the Silicon Valley executive, his name is Chris Shape, right? He's not charged in this case, has not been charged. But when I wrote that story on my website, the firm that he founded in Santa Clara, California, fired him. He was fired, but not charged. And this was reported. I was given credit for it on TechCrunch and whatnot. But when I'm talking to Chris Valenti about the DOJ not charging celebrities or, extremely wealthy people, of course, they've charged some of those people, but it's a little weird. And so maybe Chris Shape was cooperating with the feds on this case. And that might explain why he's not on trial, but he should be in Boston. He should be charged. He was doing exactly what he was helping to pay Rick Singer to fix his son's test scores through an AAU coach in Houston. You say, okay, what does that have to do with anything? Well, the guy in Houston who was working with Rick Singer was paying off a woman who was proctoring standardized tests, the taking of the tests. So she would be in a room with 50 kids taking the ACT. This AAU coach in Houston was bribing her to allow other individuals, ringers, to come in and take tests and change test scores, right? This is something that Singer did quite a bit. Finding people who could help him fix test scores or allow people to come in and take the test. And this has been documented. There are people attached to this effort by Rick Singer. And the guy in Houston has been charged in this case, right? He's been charged, but Rick Barnes hasn't. He ends up at the University of Texas, but nobody's charged. A tennis coach was charged because initially Singer had tried to get this same kid into Texas through a tennis coach and was not successful. That's when he went through Houston and the basketball angle. And it was that Houston AAU coach who was able to link Singer and his client to the basketball program. And so Barnes placed this young man on the squad as a manager. A few months later, Barnes was fired and Shaka Smart was hired. And so that young man, but that young man was let go. He was no longer a manager. Smart made a change there. So that's an example when I'm asking questions of a Boston court reporter who's sitting in on all of the important dates of that trial. He's a witness to it. He's an expert at it. But when I'm saying, wait a minute, look at all this other stuff. Look at all these people, whether they're sports celebrities or they're wealthy executives, billionaires. Why aren't they being charged? Why are we seeing in the criminal complaints from the feds and the DOJ? I've read them. Why are we seeing the USC football team, right, entangled in this case and mentioned in this case, but no one is named? We know for a fact, and this has been reported, it's out there, and these individuals are charged right now and facing jail time. Parents. We know for a fact that Singer placed at least one of these young men that he was working with, trying to help them get into college. At least he didn't place them on the USC football team, but he got this young man into USC under the pretense of being a kicker for the USC football team, but he wasn't. Donna Heinel, we mentioned earlier, she was hired by Pat Hayden, who was the AD at the time, and they were extremely close. Donna Heinel was a professional flatterer, and nobody kissed ass like Donna Heinel in that athletic department, the way she could. And that's how she got that sort of autonomy. So let's bring on now Arash Markazi. Sorry for the delay there, but let's bring on Arash Markazi. Wow, what a great guy to have on right now. From Los Angeles. I'm going on, and Arash is there. Sorry about that. Hey, Arash, okay. Thanks a lot, man. And we just had a Boston court reporter on to talk about the college admissions scandal, and I was going on and on about Donna Heinel and Pat Hayden. And by the way, I want to ask you about the Pat Hayden article that came out. Basically said Pat wasn't involved in the scandal. He was connected to Singer with a couple of different meetings and some emails. But what do you think about that situation?
Well, I always thought there was some connection there because I remember in the original report about him playing golf in Augusta, and Lynn Swan, when I talked to him, said that wasn't me. So basically process of elimination there. It was Pat Hayden.
So it was Pat, but that's not in the story, is it? That he played golf with, or
there was
did Singer?
something. Now maybe Singer didn't bring up what he was doing. No, sorry, not Singer. Who did he play golf with? He played golf with
one of the defendants' parents. Yeah, the parent.
Exactly. So
Lori's husband, I think.
Lori's husband. So that, I remember when that story came out, it was like, it was either Lynn or Pat, and Lynn's like, it wasn't me. So then it was Pat. So there was always a little bit of a connection there, but no one really knew what role Pat played in that. And I'm not saying that he did play a role, but I think there was enough smoke there that I think one can presume that, listen, if he didn't have an idea. Here's the thing, Brooks. I mean, whether they knew or not, they should have known. So I think when Lynn Swan tells me, like, I was blindsided, he might think that's a good defense. I don't think that's a good defense. I think
right. You should have known.
You should have known. Yeah, exactly.
Right. But that kind of sums up USC in our lifetime, to be honest.
Yeah, exactly.
So you wrote a really interesting article that frankly, I've lived in California. I've lived in Los Angeles for over 20 years now. I know you're a native, and you've been around a long time. Were you surprised that Kawhi Leonard and Paul George were booed, or what was the context necessarily that maybe caused that? But you were surprised. First of all, were you surprised?
No, you know what? No, because I covered the Clippers when they had Chris Paul and Blake Griffin, and Chris Paul throws up the first pitch of the Dodgers game, gets booed. Blake Griffin the same way. When they're shown on the scoreboard at either Dodger Stadium or Kings games or whatnot around Los Angeles, these are majority Laker fans. Obviously, this is still a Lakers town. So if you're a Lakers fan and you see Kawhi Leonard or you see Paul George, two guys who you wanted to join your team and two guys who chose to go to the Clippers, you're going to boo them. And so it's a unique situation for both of these guys where, listen, they're going to be cheered when they're at a Clippers game. They're going to be cheered at Clippers events. But generally speaking, if they want to throw out the first pitch at a Dodgers game or drop the puck at a Kings game or something like that, they will get booed.
What's interesting is people talk about how Los Angeles sports fans, how it's just a black hole here, right? Nobody cares about anything. They do acknowledge that the Lakers run this town when they're good. But I think the fact that, that's something that you would hear about in Chicago or in New York, that fans do that, right? The Jets fans are booing the Giants guy. But it happens in Los Angeles. To me, right there is proof that LA is truly a sports town. I
think there are two teams, Lakers and Dodgers, and USC football when they're good. But that
now, wait a minute. If let's say Mike Trout made an appearance at Dodger Stadium or something happened, he showed up for a charity event on an off day for or something like that, would Mike Trout get booed, do you think?
Yes.
Really?
It would be the same way.
Really?
It would be the same.
I don't know. Maybe from the bleachers.
Clippers rivalry. Yeah.
Well, actually, you would know. What the hell? You go to all the events around the world, but you're everywhere, so you would know. That's really interesting. So learn something with Arash every time he comes on. Visiting with Los Angeles Times columnist Arash Markazi, and in terms of Paul George, this guy's hurt now. What I don't understand is why didn't he? He's not going to come back till November. Paul George. Yeah. Why didn't he have the surgery earlier?
Yeah, he should have. But the Clippers knew when they made the trade that he was probably going to miss maybe the first 10 games of the season. It is a long season, so I know it's not ideal for him to miss the beginning of the season, but it's just 10 games. It's just the first month. But yeah, listen, he should have had surgery a lot sooner than he did.
Well, we're at the epicenter of what is the biggest story of the day, and could be the whole week, could be the whole year, and that's SB 206. Yeah. And you've been doing some coverage on your Twitter timeline, and I wanted to ask you. Haven't really heard a lot of people talking about this. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, all of a sudden pops up, right at the end of this process, and of course he's got to sign it into law. I understand that, but what was your? I'll tell you what I think first.
Okay.
I think he was grandstanding.
Sure.
And I think he's going to run. I think it's an indication he was going to run for a higher office at some point. And I think the real tell was, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm being cynical, But the whole thing on LeBron's barbershop show, The Shop, right?
Yeah.
On HBO, it was a little off-putting. I mean, what are your thoughts on it?
I thought it was a little. I mean, when you talk about grandstanding, I thought that with LeBron. I mean, LeBron didn't play college sports. I mean, he was never really affected by it. So the fact that it was on his show, and he's taking. I don't know if he's taking credit, but I mean, he's definitely like the face of this right now. But I'm just glad that it's happening. When I think back at my time at USC and Matt Leinart and Reggie Bush, and they're selling number 5 jerseys and number 11 jerseys, and they're putting their face on posters and signs, they should get that. You should be able to get compensated for your likeness, your name, and your signature.
Now your thoughts about SB 206 and the prospect of the players getting paid. And of course, I think there's a Los Angeles connection with Ed O'Bannon, because without the Ed O'Bannon case, none of this would be happening.
Exactly. And the key here is it's not just Los Angeles and it's not just California. Not involved, or maybe New York and South Carolina. If you got half the states getting involved, the NCAA is going to have to cave or make changes. First of all, you're not going to not have California. But like when Florida gets involved in Texas and New York and South Carolina, and you go down the list, they have to make
It's like election returns,
Yeah, exactly.
It's like
well, the wall's coming down.
Right. It's a really amazing time. And what's funny is the big sports mainstream media, I mean, it's all fun and games, right? But they want to tell you, the big mainstream sports media, how, of course, sports is at the center of our culture, unless it's a story like this, right?
Yeah.
So you don't get the coverage. The justice, I think, is lacking when it comes to ESPN and some of the big mainstream sports media outlets. We're visiting with Arash Markazi, Los Angeles Times sports columnist. I want to get your thoughts on USC and the situation with the AD. An AD has not been hired at USC yet. Of course, Carol Folt has finally been consummated, inaugurated at USC, the new president. And what about the athletic director, and how is that going to affect well, it's a given that Clay Helton's gone, but how's that going to affect that coaching situation going forward?
Well, so I think it will be someone who currently has that job right now. I believe it could be someone within the Pac-12, but it's the reason that they're not going to announce it right now, I think that they currently have that position and they're kind of like reaching out to certain people. It'll be interesting what kind of connection that person has. Like, would they go after a Urban Meyer or someone else? I don't know, but I think the reason that we're going to have to wait till December for that announcement is that person probably currently has a job as an athletic director, thankfully, and they don't want to leave until maybe this semester.
To me, this is an inside baseball question, but I mentioned this guy a lot on the air here. Rick Caruso, the chairman of the board of trustees, billionaire guy, high-profile guy in Los Angeles, has looked at running for mayor in the past. From my sources, he's a big part of this coaching search right now. They're looking at contingency candidates, and you've got Jeff Smuley in there. You got Bill McMorrow there. And, of course, Carol Folt has her people on her search committees. But the question for you is, how much power does Rick Caruso now have compared to Carol Folt? Is there a final call there on an AD or a coach? When it comes to Carol Folt, what's that relationship?
I would hope that Folt has the power that's been afforded to her as president. That being said, Brooks, you know as well as I do, when you talk about like Caruso and Hughes, money matters at USC. I mean, there are certain decisions that are made that are not ideal because the people behind them are worth millions of dollars. In the case of Hughes, $400 million. So they will wield power. That's just the reality of life in general, but also the reality of USC. When someone is worth that amount and they donate the amount that they do, they wield a lot of weight.
Last thing for you, the Rams. What's the story with this team? What's going on?
Listen, they have to be able to run the ball, and Todd Gurley is not the Todd Gurley that we remember last year. And if he's not going to be that player moving forward, they have to find someone who can be somewhat close to what Todd Gurley was. I don't know if Sean McVay's offense works without a running back. Listen, Todd Gurley was a top 5 player in this league. Maybe he's not going to be that, but you have to find someone who can run the ball effectively. They have not found that yet. Los
Angeles Chargers, Phillip Rivers. Where is he right now on the season? And what about his career? Are we approaching? I mean, if you were going to, we haven't talked about this. Phil Rivers' future, what's your assessment of it?
Well, I think he will stay with the team. I don't think he's looking to leave. I think the team has done everything they can to accommodate him. When you talk about the transportation from his house, basically still in San Diego, to the practice facility in Costa Mesa. So I think he will open up the new facility. He will be the quarterback of the team moving forward. The offense isn't the problem with this team. So when Melvin Gordon comes back, it wasn't like he was the missing piece. They are just hurt. And so if they can stay above water here and still be a playoff team once they get all these guys back, I think they're still going to be a force. That being said, the Patriots and the Chiefs are the class of not only the conference, but of the league.
Arash, I really appreciate it. Thanks for hopping on. Great job, man. You're doing an awesome job on the Times. You're a must follow on Twitter.
I appreciate it, Brooks. Thanks so much. I'll talk to you soon.
Arash Markazi, Los Angeles Times, and he's literally everywhere. If you follow him on his timeline, hey, I'm at the biggest events, wherever they may be. So a great follow. So he's kind of a national guy, but he's very much a local guy, and happy to have him and get the scoop on what's going on right here in Los Angeles. Now we're going to go to the Wall Street Journal and talk to Jason Gay, and he's written a piece about a subject I've been meaning to get to. Haven't been able to get to it yet. Haven't had time. Not so much the Redskins. It's all about Dan Snyder. I'm much more interested in Dan Snyder than the Redskins. Seriously. Hey, Jason, I appreciate the time, man. Thanks for hopping on.
Thanks. And it's hard to follow Rash. It's like following Mick Jagger. So I'm going to do my
totally,
best.
Man.
Okay. The guy is everywhere. You're right.
So what's the hat? What is the logo on the hat? Who is that? What team?
This is a Detroit Lions batting practice hat. This is not by no means an endorsement of Detroit baseball, but kind of like the hat. What do you think?
Yeah, it looks good, man. I like it.
Right.
So, I mean, you're all over the place on your Twitter feed. Well, you're all over the place what you're writing about in the Wall Street, but you're kind of hitting my hot buttons here.
Yeah.
You've hit SB 206.
Yeah.
But you do some things that are a little bit different. You're kind of a solutions guy. You write things from a different perspective sometimes. But the first thing I want to ask you about is Dan Snyder.
Yeah.
And you recently did something on Dan Snyder. I mean, what are your thoughts about him?
Look, I mean, Washington, it's a flame. There's recriminations everywhere, finger pointing. People are upset. And that's just the football team, Brooks. I mean, you look at the furor over impeachment, the universal thing I heard yesterday from fans of the football team, let's impeach Dan Snyder. I mean, we're going on now a generation of disappointment for this team. And it's a shame because you and I are both old enough to remember the glory days. The Washington football team was just remarkable. Joe Theismann, John Riggins, Mark Rippon, Super Bowl after Super Bowl, Joe Gibbs. There's a rich tradition to that town in football, and to see it on the wane the way that it is, and to see people who have just completely given up. The only thing it's comparable to is what we have in New York here with the basketball Knicks, where there's just this dormant, massive fan base of people who are waiting for a winner, but just are completely fed up with ownership.
What's fascinating in a way with the DC situation is, and I think we talked to a guest a couple of days ago about it, is you look at the relationship between the politicos and the Redskins, and of course the Senators in the past and the Nationals now. But if you look at the relationships and the state of them right now in Washington, there is none. There is no relationship. But in the past, it could not have been a closer relationship. And I think that kind of speaks to where we are. I think maybe it may not be DC, but just in general, when you look at where the NFL business has gone, I mean, Dan Snyder installed an IMAX theater on his yacht.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. World's first, I believe.
Right. I mean, you talk about somebody that's disconnected from I mean, is that the sense that you get, that he's completely disconnected from the world and thus reality?
I don't think he's utterly disconnected from the political world, because remember, he's also trying to bring that franchise into the town, which I think a lot of people in DC would be in favor of, sort of reviving the RFK vibe. But you're right to point out that, Jack Kent Cooke's suite was kind of the ultimate Washington salon back in its day. If you were a mover and shaker in Washington, if you were a Secretary of State, if you hosted Meet the Press, that was your spot. That was the place where power was kind of personified in the town. And obviously things have changed radically since then. Dan Snyder's box is probably a place you don't want to be at all.
Right. You don't want to be seen there.
Life,
It's like going to a nudie magazine shop or something. Oh, he's going to
It
sneak
is-
out of there, right?
It is just not, and forget about the fact that you all on top of it have to watch a Washington football game, which is a kind of dismal experience on top of all that. So again, I think it's one of these situations where we see, in a couple areas of sport where you almost want just kind of, the franchise to be taken domain, for cooler
Right.
heads to prevail from an institutional leadership standpoint and say, like, you know what? This is not happening. A reader suggested something kind of funny to me, which was like, if you take like the 2 worst teams per decade and you have them have a battle and the loser loses its ownership, what kind of situation would that be? And wouldn't that be the winner would get the ownership change? You kind of want to get that. So
Well, relegation.
interesting structure.
The whole principle of and to me, that when you talk about my interest in the EPL, the English Premier League, any of that, I'm a guy who's like, at the end of the season they have those relegation games.
Yeah.
That is for me infinitely more entertaining to watch. Watching two desperate teams, because you actually have an accountability. When you look at the NFL, it's endemic. This monopoly, this government-sponsored monopoly, dating back to the merger with the ability to collectively bargain television, that has spawned people like Michael Bidwell, where they swap out coaches and general managers in 1 year, and the new coach had a losing record at Texas Tech and got fired. I mean, that to me speaks to what's happening in Miami. And I think the media is part of it. We're calling it tanking. Tanking, it's malfeasance by the ownership in the front office, right?
Sure. And I think the other part of it too is, as you pointed to, these are franchises that have just grown in value regardless of accomplishment. I mean, if you own an NFL franchise, just the media rights alone have given you multiples and multiples of value just sitting still. Doesn't matter if you're a good team or a bad team, because as we know, in the NFL, there is media rights revenue sharing. It's not a comparable situation to any other sport. It's interesting you mentioned EPL, because in EPL, you talk to those guys, they're like, oh man, if we could ever get some of that NFL salary cap action, that's what we want. Yeah, for sure.
The hard cap.
They have a very difficult situation in there, because if they ever were to go to a kind of hard cap situation, well, what's going to happen to top talent? Well, they're going to skip over to Bundesliga or La Liga or play somewhere else, play in another European league. So it's not the kind of, like, as you put it correctly, in this massive national monopoly where they control all of the product. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I'm curious. I don't know if we'll ever see it in our lifetime. It seems like a fool's errand, but if the NFL was ever to have a competitor who could actually crack through some of that, it would be an interesting situation. But I just think their grip is too strong.
Listen, look at the NFL in the immediate preceding years before the AFL, and then once the AFL came in. One interesting angle to the NFL and the AFL is the AFL, when it started, recruited African-American players and was instrumental in integrating, not desegregating where it was tokenism, but actually integrated because of the competitive situation. The NFL remained token desegregation. But when we came with the merger, that AFL product then bled over into the NFL, and we got full integration in the NFL. That's my opinion. That's the way I read it. You're not going to read that in a book. But it just speaks. I mean, there's a reason they call them franchises. It's like McDonald's. They're all in this. They're under this overarching corporation. And what drives me nuts is the idea it's all about winning. And it's not. Sports. Keep politics out of sports. What are you talking about? There's politics on the field right now in terms of just how the coaches operate. I'm sorry, I'm going crazy filibustering here, but you got me fired up.
No, I hear you. And this is something that touches a button with me every time, that conversation happens about whether politics belongs in sport. And I just feel like they're inherently intertwined in the notion that you can somehow extract politics from these games.
It's a red herring.
It's just absurd. Yeah.
Now, we're visiting with Jason Gay of the Wall Street Journal. You also did a piece on SB 206 that I alluded to. And the things that I'm seeing in the way you write, you kind of offer something that's sort of a solution. So tell us about your perspective on SB 206.
Well, I think
paying athletes.
Yeah, no, let's sort of like detangle this a little bit, because I think one of the things that's happening here is we're kind of, and I'm not saying you're doing it, but I feel like in the general conversation that's happening here, is this has somehow been characterized as tantamount to paying players, which it is not. Basically, all you're doing here with SB 206 is you're giving collegiate athletes the right that every other college student has the ability to do, which is to make a profit off their name, image, and likeness. This is something that if you're a music scholarship candidate, if you're an acting scholarship person, if you're a chemist, if you're anybody on a college campus, except for a college athlete, you have the right to make a profit off of. This is not saying that the universities have to pay the athletes. This is not saying that you're going to somehow, give stipends to athletes or anything like that. This is simply rewarding or awarding a right that every other college student has besides the college athlete. Now, that said, is there a sort of seismic moment in terms of the NCAA's bluff being called? Yes, sure, of course, because as you and Narash were talking about, California is just too big to ignore here. They are a substantial piece of the package when you consider just the volume of schools, the number of athletes, the kind of schools, the media rights, the media cities that are in there, the Los Angeleses, the Bay Areas, and so on. These are not people that the NCAA can easily ignore. And as you pointed out, there's active legislation in places like North Carolina, Florida, Texas, New York. The pendulum is starting to swing. This is business that the NCAA itself has alluded to having an interest in taking care of. In fact, Condoleezza Rice came out in favor of name, image, and likeness reform last year. But, we know the structure of the NCAA. It's dilly-dally, dilly-dally, dilly-dally. And I applaud the fact that states are kind of jumping in here, at least to force their hand. California, this is not going to radically change things. These things are not going to be unrecognizable from what they look like today. It's simply sort of changing a little bit of the structure to make them just like any other college student on campus.
Now, that said, here's my perspective, and I just tweeted about this. But when you look at Mark Emmert, who's pathological, of course, but saying this is an existential threat to the NCAA, people may take that as being hyperbolic. But I absolutely agree with him.
Yeah,
because
sure.
Why would you, first of all, the NCAA, why are they hysterically protesting about this, about something that the schools are not on the hook for financially? Well, the reason is they know that this is inevitably, I think it's inevitably going to lead to a full-blown compensation model where the schools compensate the players. Wait, I mean, do you think that it will?
It may, but I think that this is important to sort of let it play out. I mean, an important part of this factor here is that this is going to think, people are pointing out to like legal, injunctions and things to prevent it from happening. First of all, it doesn't happen until 2003. So whether or not we'll even get there before the NCAA does, it would be an interesting conversation. But this applies to every single sport. This applies to men and women athletes. This applies to revenue sports and non-revenue sports. Anybody can take advantage of this. When you start talking about paying players, you get into the very sort of legally tricky area of deciding what sports are to be rewarded. You obviously can't start paying stipends and salaries across all sports in every university. That's just unsustainable. So you're going to have some sort of legal caveats made. You're going to have to get courts to rule on the idea that, in specific instances, specifically men's football, men's college basketball, where the money is not hundreds of millions, but billions of dollars, an exception can be made to give these people some piece of that financial puzzle. But I keep coming back to this point because I see a lot of conversation in the last 24 hours, Brooks, about, the thicket of corruption that's going to be created by this. The idea that some university will have, car dealers offering $2 million deals for 5-star high school recruits. Just because something is difficult, just because something has the potential to be extremely disruptive, does not excuse the right to do the need to do the correct thing, which is what this name, image, and likeness bill is really effectively doing, which is the right thing.
Yeah, it's amazing though when it's the emperor has no clothes. I mean that,
sure.
But I can't thank you, Jason, for coming on. I want to have you on again, man. That was outstanding.
Anytime. I'm fresh from the gym. I'm ripped, as you can tell, and ready to go.
Swole.
Appreciate the opportunity. I'm swole. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks. That's Jason Gay joining us from the Wall Street Journal, and he piqued my interest with his articles about SB 206. Offering a solution of sorts, and then also Dan Snyder. Those are two good subjects, two good topics The kind of thing you're going to hear when you watch this show here, what you'll see, you'll hear, and also you can comment on this show. We did a little college football today with David Jones from the Harrisburg Patriot News. You see me working here, right? We're doing this every day, and we're bringing in people who I know or I've followed and who know me, and we're developing those relationships together here, Sports by Brooks on Fancred, so we can avail ourselves of people like Chris Villani. Hopefully, he's in the courtroom covering the college admission scandal. So when something happens, you like to think. That's what we're doing here, and I appreciate you being along for the ride. We're going to continue to do this every day, Monday through Friday. We're going to be doing football primarily throughout the week, every week. But we've got some interesting facets popping up here with SB 206 in particular. And that, of course, is, as I allude to it, it is the ability of collegiate athletes to benefit financially from their own name and their own likeness. What a concept. It's like this is Turkmenistan. College athletes don't get that ability, right? But the schools, they make billions of dollars off those same athletes. You know, the whole discussion, though, is framed, and I want to speak to this before we say goodbye today. The whole discussion is framed around the overarching disgraceful injustice that's been perpetrated. And it, in my mind, it is a crime against these athletes, essentially stealing billions of dollars from them. And what's particularly disgusting is you can't swing a dead cat without seeing a new weight room facility, new locker room. Look at this, a reception area, right? All that stuff. The stadium's being renovated without seeing that on an ESPN broadcast. Let's take a look at, we've got the best facilities. And of course you see it on Twitter, and the players, of course, they're going to buy into it. That's how they're lured into the situation with those shiny objects. They're given everything but what is actually valuable, right? All the accoutrements of status and wealth without the wealth. And when they're done playing in that college football environment without the status, most of them. It's amazing. You know, we're told by the media that the scholarship is so important. I just heard a guy, I'm driving in to do the show, and I sound like a coward here. Maybe I am. I'm not mentioning names. But there was somebody on a show this morning as a guest, but he's a host. And he's going on and on about how wonderful it is to be on scholarship and to be an athlete. And this guy came from not necessarily a privileged background, but middle-class guy. Had a lot of advantages growing up. A lot. Not a typical situation. I don't want to get into it because I don't want to out the guy, but because he's not here. He's going on and on about it. And I'm going to get sick, because the whole point is when you look at college football and basketball, and that pays the bills for everything else, all the other teams in the athletic department, the expenses, you name it, the football team and the basketball team pays the bills. Or at some school, most schools, those are the programs that are going to drive up the debt, like at Rutgers, and then the students in the student body have to make up for that shortfall with increased student fees, right? So, when you think about all of the players that are on that football team, 80% of them are African American, and probably the majority of them come from less than privileged backgrounds, right? And the argument for amateurism doesn't include that. When I look at African Americans playing college football, there's so many of them, because I've been around it my whole life. I've been in locker rooms. I was a walk-on at the University of Georgia, for crying out loud, for 5 years. My teammates, right? In many ways, those players, I mean, number one, they're not allowed to take the classes that they should be taking for life after football. Trust me, they're not. It's not a typical situation. And they are segregated from the rest of the student body in the athletic dorm, right? But I don't think it's too much to say that these college athletes that I'm speaking of, they're fighting for their lives here. They're playing for their life, their future life, whether it be in pro football or to create a profile that will help them after football, wherever they're happen to be playing, because that will set them. An example would be, let's say you play at Ohio State. If you have a good career or you're a scholarship player, get on the field, you're set for life in Columbus. And it's like that in every college town, major college town. But these guys are fighting for their lives. They come from less than privileged backgrounds and financially adverse backgrounds, some extreme. And that's the whole point of this argument. For me, it is the whole point, the whole argument against, first of all, it's not amateurism, is, and then on top of that, the guy who's saying those things this morning knows that the NCAA rules don't exist. They don't exist. Money under the table, especially in basketball, college basketball. Adidas and Nike, they're the ones who field the teams. They're the ones who bring the players to Coach K. And it's a tacit thing. I don't want to know, Coach K. That's the situation. If you're wondering why, wait a minute, why isn't Coach K been involved in the FBI investigation? Because they're deliberately keeping him away from that. Right? He's raised that to an art form. So that's the key point here, right? The people that are placed in these situations, the majority of them come from financially adverse situations, including their family. And you can't, and so if you're coming from a place where you're always going to have a safety net and you're not, it's easy to argue for no compensation, do it for the team, do it for the love of the game. I'll leave you with this. Do it for the love of the game, right? That principle, right? The only athletes who play for the love of the game are guys like LeBron James, because he has all the money in the world now. He's set for life, right? He doesn't have to worry about it. He can play for the love of the game. Mike Trout, with his contract with the Angels, he can play. Kawhi Leonard, those guys, they play for the love of the game, right? College athletes, at least the exact guys that are paying the bills for everybody else, for the country club kids who are driving around in BMWs and have a tennis scholarship, that's being funded by the football team. And if it's not funding it, right, student fees are funding it, raised student fees every single year. But remember that the only athletes who are playing for the love of the game are guys like Tom Brady. They can afford to play for the love of the game. Most of the guys who matter in college sports can't. So that's going to do it for today's show. My thanks to our producer today in Boston, Cam Smith. And I want to thank our guests who were David Jones from the Harrisburg Patriot News, Jason Gay from the Wall Street Journal, Arash Markazi from the Los Angeles Times, Chris Villani from Law 360. We'll be back tomorrow. More football of the college variety and the NFL. And we're also going to talk some basketball, NBA style, Lakers style, with an insider there. So come on back, y'all. This is Brooks Melchior from Los Angeles saying so long. This has been Sports by Brooks on Fancred.